Fujifilm cameras are best known for the straight out of camera images, hands down. But in recent years, Fujifilm has quietly made an amazing improvement with the video capabilities in almost all of their cameras. But the question is, which one do you choose? But before I forget, make sure to like and subscribe if you're new to this channel. Also, everything that I mentioned for these cameras or any other gear you might see, there's going to be links in the description below. I am recording this manually, so if I might drift out of focus, I am so sorry. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Joshua, and today's going to be a very chill video. We're going to be talking about Fujifilm cameras and which one's going to be the best for you for making videos. I've been a long-time Fujifilm user, probably for the last 6 years or so, and I've owned multiple cameras, so I have pretty good knowledge, but I definitely came into it when they started doing more videos in their cameras. Speaking of that, let's actually talk about a brief history of how Fujifilm started to move into this video world. The very first camera that comes to mind is the X-H2S. I actually owned this camera way back in 2018, and this was a big deal for Fujifilm. This is where they really want to get into the filmmaking space and put a capable video camera in the ever-booming market that was happening during that time. You had Sony, you had Panasonic, you had all these different cameras touting all these amazing video specs, and Fujifilm wanted to kind of get some of that, get into that mix a little bit. And so they introduced the X-H2S. This touted the f-log profile for color, 4K resolution, and really great ergonomics. The X-H2S was more of the traditional mirrorless body style, deeper grip, wider body, and it had this nice little screen on top to see all your settings. And not long after that, the X-T5 was introduced. This had everything the X-H2S had, but it retained the retro style that we all come to love and know with Fujifilm. Then a few years after that, the X-T4 really kind of changed everything for Fujifilm. It kind of gave a little bit more respect to what Fujifilm wanted to do in the video space. This camera, the X-T4, was targeted for creators like myself and those who are watching this video because it had a flip-out screen.
It's got a flip-out screen.
And it was actually one of the cameras that I used, and a lot of the creators you see on this channel had used for years as well. So with the flip-out screen, internal body stabilization, and a better battery life, this was the camera that a lot of people start to turn their heads to. It's like, oh look, Fujifilm is actually doing something over here. That was really cool to see. These three cameras I consider the cornerstones for Fujifilm as they made their way into more of the video space, and for the cameras that we see today. I have with me Fujifilm's next generation hybrid photo and video cameras, the X-T5, the X-M5, the X-S20, and the X-H2S, my personal camera. And so for the sake of simplicity, I won't mention the GFX 102, that's my other camera, just because the GFX system is in a whole nother class of its own. These cameras that I'm looking at today all have the same lens mount, they're all Super 35, and generally the cost isn't as extreme as the GFX camera. So it'll make it a lot easier to follow along. Now, I can already tell you that the best camera Fujifilm makes for professional video is the X-H2S. I've used this camera extensively over the last 2.5 years for paid commercials, YouTube content, short narratives, docs, you name it, it's a workhorse. This camera fits my style of filming, however, it might not fit your style. So let's find out what camera is best for you. Okay, let's start with the X-T5. This is kind of like the elephant in the room, just because it doesn't have a flip-out screen like the other cameras I'm going to mention. However, Fujifilm did put some video specs in here that's worth mentioning, and it is pretty much that sweet spot for a hybrid and photo camera in my opinion. Now, Fujifilm has put 6.2K open gate in almost all their cameras now, which is pretty insane to say because that's a very useful video format in terms of resolution and that aspect ratio, because now you can get a 9:16 or 16:9 or a square out of that single image and not lose any qualities. Thumbs up! You get 4K resolution, obviously. You have 10-bit internally as well. And outside of that, that's pretty much what this camera can really do. Now, before I mention who I think this is for, there are some cons about this setup if you're using it mainly for video. First one being is that this does overheat. Now, Fujifilm brought out a fan module for some of their cameras, and unfortunately this doesn't work for that. It would normally sit right behind the screen and it will have 2 screw points that you can screw into like the X-H2S, but it doesn't have it here. So what I recommend for all Fuji cameras is to actually go into the settings and go to the temperature setting and set that to high. That generally keeps the camera from overheating, and that's what I do for all my Fujifilm cameras, the GFX, my X-H2S, any camera that I have. I just make sure I do that just in case if I start recording video it does give me a bit more extra flexibility in that case. And realistically, I haven't actually seen my cameras overheat ever since I switched to that setting in camera. There is a high rolling shutter when shooting open gate, so that's something to definitely be aware of. And outside of that, 4K is good enough, really. Another con is that Fujifilm reverted back to the micro HDMI, which should not be in any camera in 2025 in my opinion, but here we are. And yeah, it's not that robust, but there you have it. It is snug right there if you want to do anything externally. Outside of that, this camera is for the photographer first. Hence, they went back to that style that the X-T5. Think of this as the beefier, more advanced version of the X-T5, 40 megapixels, you know, all that good stuff, the newer film simulation. And it's a really good all-around camera. And if you just want to stay behind the camera, just recording and taking photos, this might be the one you want to look at. Now, personally, I've been on and off of testing this camera just because I do want an everyday carry. And I thought the X-T5 would be that for me. It isn't. I realized I lean a lot more towards video work. And so a lot of times these dials, though they're cool, I find myself fumbling. So when I'm switching from photo to video, and if I don't have my shutter speed in a certain angle, my shutter speed is hiked up on the video side, you want to keep it down to, like, you know, what your frame rate is, double your frame rate. And so I found myself just kind of fighting these dials when I switched over to video, and I'd rather not do that. So this is probably not the camera for me in my own search, but it's something I wanted to mention to you all thinking about this camera. Jumping over to the X-M5, this is the most recent camera out of the bunch. And man, my first impressions when I saw, I've seen images of how small this is, but holding this in my hand, this thing is tiny.
This is like as big.
Your phone's bigger than it.
This could be a pro or a con for a lot of people, but we'll get to that in a little bit second. Overall, the design is really compact, and this is actually my favorite lens combo for any and all Fujifilm cameras that I get in my hands. This is the 7 Artisans 35 f1.4. Very cheap lens, but it is beautiful. It's a beautiful manual lens for photo and stills. I digress, but I really like this little setup. When I was down in Atlanta, Caleb and I had a job with Home Depot, and this was my kind of director's camera. I had it around my neck, a little short strap, and I was able to snap off a bunch of photos that way when we were doing our tech scout and director scout. This made it really convenient just to kind of pull it out or just take it off of my chest and snap some photos. Overall, it grew on me. Like at first I thought, man, this is too small. But over time, it felt right in the hand, especially when I got the hang of how I wanted to do like some street shooting. I would hold the camera like this for a lot of portrait stuff, and it was just really easy to use. I'll put on my 13mm Viltrox lens if I wanted to vlog anything or capture things in a moment. So it became pretty useful for how tiny this is. But over time, I did miss having a EVF, a viewfinder. And oftentimes I will pull up the camera and immediately go like this. I'm like, oh wait, I don't have a viewfinder. So the size is amazing, but I think that's one big thing that's missing in my opinion, is just that viewfinder. Outside of that, again, this has 6.2 open gate, which I kind of live in with this camera. It has 10-bit internal as well, 422. Now the pros, which is going to be kind of funny to say for this one, but it is the size. If you're looking for a super compact, high quality camera for photo and stills, this is going to be the camera that you're looking for. It is really tiny. The biggest lens I will put on this is my Viltrox 13mm. That's the one I'll carry around if I want to do more vlogging. I just really love that lens. When it comes to the added features that they put on here, they did bring over this film simulation dial from the X-S20, and I'll show that a little bit later. But this one has, instead of it being a black dial, it shows you all the film simulations on there you can kind of cycle through. And I think that's cool. I think it's fine. There is a vlog mode on here, but I barely use that. I just set it to exactly how I want it with my custom settings. If you want to know what my custom settings are for this camera, I'll just make sure to put them in the description here or put it on screen for your enjoyment and your use case. Now, the downsides of this camera, I will start again with the size. Again, I'd say it's like a pro and a con. If you put on larger lenses, it's going to feel really imbalanced. And the fact that it is so small that they did have to compromise with the battery. This is an older battery. This battery does not last long with the higher resolutions of this camera and the longer record times. And again, if overheating is an issue for you, it does have the option to put the fan, and again, I would say change that setting to high. Your SD card is at the bottom as well. I find this to be an issue too because this quarter 20 is not centered, relatively centered. No, it's not centered. It's not centered at all. And what that does is when I put on a plate on here or whatever that is, it actually blocks this door if I want to get into my SD card to switch it out. So the fact that, they have to make some compromises on the size here, and it really does show. Again, it has micro HDMI, a headphone jack, a mic jack, and all those other things. And there's no IBIS. I know that was a big thing that everybody was really upset about, but it's a pro and a con. You get your IBIS through the lens. So if you're using Fujifilm lenses that have image stabilization in it, that's when it'll communicate the IBIS, but there's no internal IBIS on this camera. I don't mind it. I don't use IBIS at all for any of my videos. I'll just, stabilize it if I can, but sometimes we kind of like that, real life jerkiness. I don't like the wobbled edges anyway, so I prefer to avoid that as much as possible. I think the value that this camera gives, though, outside of everything I just said, is really impressive, and you wouldn't go wrong with this. Like, you get the great image quality, the great video qualities. It's a really compact camera. Like, you can almost sometimes forget that this camera is in your bag somewhere. But the fact that it's under $1,000, you get this level of image out of this camera, like, it's hard to beat. So now next on the list is the X-S20. Now this series of cameras has actually been one of my favorite. I think it's a really good blend between compact, but still have a really robust ergonomics. Like, look how deep this grip is if it wants to focus on me. Anyway, this is a very deep grip and it makes it really comfortable to hold. I previously owned the XS10 and we did do the launch for both of these cameras on the channel. But this is pretty much one of my favorite little pickup Fujifilm cameras because it still gives me the functionalities that I want and in a very small and lightweight body that I don't really normally want to rig up. Now, we'll probably throw in a cage on this, but this is technically my wife's camera. I bought this for her. Top level features, again, 6.2K open gate, internal body stabilization, 422 10-bit internal recording. And remember when I mentioned earlier that the dial for the film simulations was on the X-M5, but it had like all the names printed on there. Well, this is what that dial is here. However, it is a blank dial, which is I like better. You can kind of customize it exactly to what you want. But by default, this is the simulation dial for going through all the different sims. And then you have your dial here, front and back dial here, which is really handy. Yeah, this shares the same battery as my X-H2S, which is great. So it shares the same battery as the X-T5, the X-T4, the X-H2S. This is even the GFX, they all share this same battery. And this is a really good battery. Lasts quite a bit of while when recording and such for photo or for video. And outside of all of this, I don't have a lot of complaints about this camera outside of it being and having a micro HDMI. This is the Achilles heel of these smaller cameras. It's the micro HDMI. But if that's not something that you're concerned about, this is a fantastic pickup. And to be honest, even though I said earlier that the best camera for video is the X-H2S for professional use, it is. This comes next in my opinion. This has a ton of just positive features around this camera and it's really hard to go wrong. Now, if you need ProRes, if you need, oh, it got really bright now. Is that too dark? Especially if you don't need all these flashy codecs like ProRes or external recording, anything like that, that micro HDMI doesn't really matter unless you need to see your picture a little bit better, so you're going to be using a monitor. But outside of that, this camera checks all the boxes and then some. This is actually one of my favorite cameras, and I actually do recommend this when people ask me what's their first Fujifilm camera to get if they want to do both photo and video. Granted, all these are really fantastic to pick up and do it, but if you want a really good deal and, price and just the way this is built and the features, the XS20 is the way to go. All right, last but not least, the Fujifilm X-H2S, my beloved camera. This is actually the longest standing camera that I've owned. It's going on 3 years now. and I was super excited, one, to be part of the launch when they first announced this camera and put it on the channel here. I've done several videos on their channel about this camera and my channel as well. If you want to see more Fujifilm content, definitely head over to Cine Dailies. That's my YouTube channel, link in the description below. But outside of that, this camera is made for the professional. Yes, it's not perfect. No camera is perfect, but it's perfect for what I needed to do. And it comes down to, what do you actually like? Out of all these cameras that I've shown, it's not about finding the best camera that has the best specs. It's about finding the best camera that has the best features for you to create the work that you want to create. And that's what I really appreciate Fujifilm's philosophy about when they're making these cameras. They are putting in some of the latest and greatest tech that they have to offer. Granted, some variations of that, but it doesn't skimp out on the quality that they want to have in their cameras. And you just choose the body style from that, whether it be more of a traditional, mirrorless camera body, or you want the dials, or you want something more compact. Fujifilm doesn't really skimp out on that, because they do have the creator in mind in a lot of different ways. Granted, there's definitely areas to improve on. But for me, this camera has checked a lot of boxes. And yes, I would love to see some other features in this camera, which I'm going to be talking about much later. But outside of what it can do, it didn't hinder me from actually creating. And that's the point. The point is, don't let this camera body or cameras hinder you from what you want, how you want to get your vision out there. I did not mean to make this into a soap opera box, but I'm gonna get off my high horse right now. But a lot of different ways, this camera just checks a ton of boxes, and I'm curious to see what they do with the next generation. Hopefully there is a next generation, because there's a lot of improvements that this can be. Okay, so enough of the rambling. The pros of this camera: you have, again, 6.2K open gate. You have internal ProRes recording. ProRes is a much more beefier professional workflow codec that a lot of us use for editing, recording and editing. It has F-Log2 and F-Log2C, which is their new F-Log Gamma, and it gives you more richness in the colors. It doesn't really increase the dynamic range of the camera, but this has usable dynamic range of around 13 stops, stacked CMOS sensor, so you have a really fast readout, and it's just a great all-around camera. And I've kind of covered this to the T, from using it in all various ways, traveling with it, you name it. So this camera's been with me in a lot of different scenarios and has always performed, and it has not conked out on me. That's my personal experience. Again, if any of these cameras, if you are the professional, if you're just the enthusiast, if you are the photographer who wants a little bit of video capabilities on the side, if you want to have just the best of both worlds and have an all-around camera, there's so many different cameras that I've mentioned today. Even their older cameras can offer you those things that you might be looking for. Now, in terms of price, all the cameras from listing from low to high, the X-M5 is the cheapest, around $900. Then you have the X-S20, which is around $1,300. Then you have the X-T5, around $1,700. And then you still have this bad boy at $2,500 for a Super 35 sensor that's incredibly gorgeous. Pro tip, and if you want to get a full frame look out of your Fujifilm camera, just use a speed booster. I made a video about this too. But yeah, that can give you a full frame equivalent. So yeah, guys, that is the end of this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. It was a little bit of rambling, but I'm pretty passionate about Fujifilm, and I really enjoy this camera brand, and I'm a Fujifilm loyalist, to be honest. I'm always going to have some sort of a Fujifilm camera with me at some point in my career, and it has been true for the last 7 or 8 years or so. Anyway, all right, so that wraps it up for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know which is your favorite Fujifilm camera that you're using right now. All right, y'all, I'll catch you next time. Peace.